And that changed my life. And we talk all the time in the church about seek the giver and not the gift. And that's really what it's all about. Because those were two people who could have cared less about my gift. What I gave was not going to affect them directly or indirectly whatsoever. What they cared about was me, a timid, partially committed servant of Jesus Christ. And they challenged me to deal with myself. And I really began to hear the call from the Lord to tithe. Now, I'd heard about tithing. I'd been in seminary. But we learned how to come up with reasons not to deal with that. See, that in the normal human capacity to rationalize is of course quite impressive, but when you equip that normal natural human faculty with a theological education, the ability to explain to God why we don't need to respond is really quite significant and impressive. And I had lots of good reasons to tell God why I didn't need to do this, most of which boiled down to the fact that I was giving all of myself to God, therefore I didn't need to give my money. And my wife has also been to seminary, and as I came back and started to share my sense that we needed to deal with this, she thought I had absolutely lost touch with reality. But we began to pray about it, began to talk about it, and we decided to move forward in our giving. Because what I really heard in my own prayers was that as much as I was giving my time, traveling all around and beginning to do stewardship work and giving my time for the church, as much as I really believed that God gave me the gifts that I have to do the ministry that I have, I came to realize that I was attempting to use time, talent, and treasure as interchangeable parts, and to give the most convenient one at any given time. And I came to understand that there were indeed times in my life where I was willing to write a check as long as I didn't have to be involved with those kinds of people. And there were times when I was willing to be involved with people as long as it didn't affect my lifestyle. And that I was using both as a dodge from dealing with God's claim on my life. And so, in our family, we began to move forward in our own giving. And we began to work toward the tithe. And it got exciting. We began to make some real progress in that. And we moved in stages toward the tithe. And though money had not been the easiest subject for us to talk about, it got easier. And we began to look forward to conversations in the fall as to how much more we can give in the coming year. How much will we do? And as we came to that point where I was going to be making a tithe pledge on what I was earning, came to the point of moving to a new congregation, a mission church, for whom the counsel and advice of the bishop about the minimum salary was a new thought. And they were struggling with paying me, and I was struggling with that salary and the change and all that went into it. My wife was 7 months pregnant, going to be out of work for a period of time, and we were attempting to buy our first house. Interest rates were 18%. And we had said this was the time we were going to make the step to tithe. And though we'd made progress and experienced a tremendous amount of joy and release as we had moved forward, for me all of a sudden it all came back crashing down on me again. And it was like I had to make the decisions all over again. And look one more time at how much do I really believe this? How much do I trust? And I don't know how to explain it. I can't talk about it without sounding corny. But I do know that we decided to go ahead and make that commitment to the tithe. And I never had a sleepless night about that mortgage. The kind of peace, the kind of freedom from anxiety about possessions that we experienced as we moved forward was something that I hadn't even been smart enough to ask for. And God has continued to touch us and free us up from that burden, that anxiety, that pressure, that tendency to evaluate ourselves based on what we have. Well, the more teaching and the more talking about stewardship I found myself doing, the more I began to find myself challenging myself without intending to. We talk often about the tithe as the minimum standard for Christian giving. And I would talk about that. And then one night, in the middle of teaching that in our own congregation, I had a little internal war going on, at which point I said to the group, the tithe is the minimum standard for Christian giving, at which point I said to myself, or perhaps indeed God said to me, through me, then why do you treat it as if it were the maximum? And I'd fallen into that trap of the tithe becoming a legalism in that when you get there, you have arrived, and you stick in your thumb and pull out a plum and say, what a good boy am I, and that I wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. And at that moment, I realized that I needed to continue to step forward. And so I'm in that place, and I share this not in any kind of prideful sense, but out of very real awareness of where I have come and how God has been gracious to me and has led me. We're to the point where we give 14% of what we earn to our parish church. And then other giving to other ministries beyond the parish, we do over and above that pledge to our parish. For me, that's 14% of it all. Housing allowance and utilities allowance and the whole 9 yards. How you calculate that, I believe, is your business before God. I'll be happy to talk about that the second session. But for me, it has simply changed my life. To experience more and more what it means to put my faith into practice. My secretary, who is here from St. Margaret's Church, likes to tell me that she and her husband say, stewardship is what we do after we say we believe. And that's where it is. That's what it boils down to, is the so what of our faith. And for me, as God has called me forward, and I have at times fearfully, at times indeed joyfully responded to that, God has changed me in ways that are impossible for me to describe. But I am a different person because of what God has done in my life. And for me, that's what stewardship is all about. Now, there are lots of reasons to give, some of them not very exalted. God, I think, has one motive for giving: thankfulness. There are lots of other motives for giving, however, and we need to be on guard against them. The 116th Psalm, says, "What shall I render to the Lord for all his bounty to me?" The motive for Christian giving is thankfulness. Thankfulness. Not pride, not duty, not guilt, not fear, not because it's a good cause. The motive for Christian giving is thankfulness. I read in an airline magazine recently a story out of Miami. Down one of the main streets in Miami, Flagler Street, there were a number of beautiful, tall, royal palm trees lining the street. And one night, vandals came and cut down 6 of the palm trees. And the city didn't have the money to replace them. And they thought they would just have to leave them bare in that spot. Until one day, finally, a donor came forward and offered to replace the trees at private expense. Whereas the former trees were 15 feet tall and provided a beautiful foreground to a big Delta Airlines billboard, the new palm trees were 35 feet tall and completely hid the billboard. The donor? Eastern Airlines. There are lots of motives for giving. But let me venture a statement with you. I believe that if the motive that we are talking about in our churches is not thanksgiving to the Lord Jesus Christ, then what we are degenerating into is fundraising. If you are interested in raising funds, there are lots of ways of doing it. You know, you can see the ads in the magazines that you can feed this hungry child or you can turn the page. You know, those kind of guilt-producing things. Most of us have schools of higher learning that are past masters at using most of the arm twist kinds of methods of raising money. Or we can talk about our thankfulness to the Lord God. And that, for me, is Christian giving. It is so easy to slip into those other methods, to talk about people's duty, that we have this responsibility to keep the church open? And do you know how much it costs to maintain this church every day? And do you know how much it costs to provide education for your children and what this costs to... And you have a responsibility. Some will respond to that. But if they respond, I don't think they will necessarily come one step closer to their Lord who created them. They may get closer to the church, but not necessarily closer to God. Jesus says the Gentiles love to be thought benefactors. In my experience, Episcopalians do too. If you can put a plaque on it, you can sell it in the Episcopal Church. There is a sense in which we can appeal to people's desire to feel generous. Even if you don't boast about it in the church, people indeed like to feel generous. And we can slip into that kind of payoff for our giving. Or perhaps the one that's most subtle is the good cause. There are important ministries that you need to support. And indeed that is true. And we'll talk more about that in the next hour. But the first step has to be, why do I give? And once I'm clear about the fact that I give in thankfulness for what God has done in my life, then we can discuss what I will give to support. But first we have to be clear about why we give. And then we'll talk about where that giving goes. So often we skip the motive and move immediately to the purpose of the giving, in which case the purpose becomes the motivator. And it brings people closer to that ministry, but not necessarily closer to the God who calls us to do that ministry. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 28. God tells us some of the benefits of obedience to his word. Be careful to heed all these words which I command you, that it may go well with you and with your children after you forever, when you do what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. Give, obey, that it may go well with you. Now, I talk about this a great deal and got a good deal of static from people who said that that's pretty sloppy theology, John. And I went on one of the National Church Stewardship conferences, and one of the resource persons for that workshop was a seminary professor of Old Testament who, without any prompting from me, picked up this passage and used it and explained that what God is saying to us is indeed that obedience to his command leads us into a quality of life that we would not know otherwise. It is not, in my view, a tit-for-tat kind of, if you give, you will thereby be promised to sell more insurance next year, and that your 90% giving post-tithe next year will exceed your 100% giving pre-tithe this year, as if God is some kind of cosmic E.F. Hutton that will automatically provide you a return on your investment. I know a church in Florida that promised its parishioners that if they tithed, God would promise to increase their salary post-tithe the following year. Money-back guarantee. Well, one guy tithed and he didn't get a raise, and he sued the church in court for breach of promise. And to some extent, I think the church deserved it, because I don't think that's what God talks about. I think God makes it very clear that he will meet our needs. But for a lot of us, one of the things that we're going to discover is the difference between our needs and our wants. And in my life, God has liberated me from a lot of wants that I used to call needs. I believe that God indeed does meet our needs. God calls us to follow his way because it is good for us.